Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Hey everyone, welcome to Sports Spectrum's podcast. I am Jason Romano. So glad you're joining us on the show today. Jimmy Dykes is our guest today. He's ESPN's college basketball analyst. Before we get to our conversation with Jimmy, I want to thank our sponsors and presenters here on today's podcast. International Justice Mission, IJM, helping to protect more than 150 million people from violence worldwide. They do such great work and they need your help. Check out their website, ijm.org/TF, to become a freedom partner and join the fight against violence and oppression. And we're also sponsored today and presented by Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world. A chance for you to release a child from poverty is available right now. These are children all across the world waiting to be released from poverty. Check out the website, compassion.com/sportspectrum, compassion.com/sportspectrum, and consider sponsoring a child today. Excited to welcome Jimmy Dykes here to Sports Spectrum. Excited to welcome Jimmy Dykes back to Sports Spectrum. He was on last fall telling his story of sports and faith and getting ready for the college basketball season. And here we are now, April 6, 2020, and we're supposed to be crowning college basketball's national champion tonight. And that's not happening now because college basketball, like every other sport, has been put on hold and canceled because of the coronavirus outbreak. So our conversation with Jimmy is going to be a little different than what I had originally anticipated when I booked this interview. But Jimmy's got a new book out. It's called The Film Doesn't Lie, Evaluating Your Life One Play at a Time. And it's a great book. I've read it through it. It's awesome. It's a lot of sports, but even more than that, it's a lot of Jesus. And I'm really excited for people to check out and read Jimmy Dykes' new book. Let's have a conversation here with ESPN college basketball analyst Jimmy Dykes joining us on Sports Spectrum. Take a listen. Jimmy, welcome back to Sports Spectrum.
Jason, it's great to be back with you, man. It's always good to hear your voice. I love listening to your stuff. You do a tremendous job, and it's an honor and a blessing to be back on with you.
Thank you, sir. It's great to have you back. And when we originally booked this interview, my thought was, okay, we're going to talk some March Madness. We're going to have this be on the national championship night for college basketball, which is supposed to be tonight. And you have a new book coming out. The conversation is going to change a little bit. We're still going to talk about your new book, of course. It's called The Film Doesn't Lie, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But this was supposed to be the night that we were going to be talking about two teams playing for the national title, and maybe I think this is the first time ever, that isn't going to be the case. There is no champion, and life as we know it has changed forever. What's this been like for you these past few weeks, watching everything kind of transpire the way it has?
Well, I think I'm probably like everybody else. You know, it's just an unusual time for all of us. You know, this is supposed to be a time for college basketball fans that we're celebrating the game and all the upsets and all the stories that we just will never know how they were going to be ultimately written. And there were some great ones waiting to happen, I think, with Obi Toppin at Dayton and how good they were, Gonzaga, you know, some teams that not in those power conferences that I really felt could make a deep run and get all the way to the Final Four. But we'll never know. So it's been a time of, honestly, for me, it's been a time of reflection. It's been a time of reprioritizing my life. I thought I had it, you know, in pretty good priority, but it's allowed me to kind of reprioritize what's important to me. I think it's probably helped me put sports in its proper perspective, and maybe it's done that for a lot of people. I know it has for me. I love it, man. It's my job. I live in the weeds of college basketball, as you know. But I think there's some purification going on maybe in my own heart to make sure that I have things in proper balance in my life. But certainly, man, you feel so bad, Jason, for those coaches and teams and players that, man, they had a chance this year and then now they'll never know. So they have to rest in what they accomplished up to that point. And just, you know, keep their heart right in those areas.
Put yourself back into your coaching, role, if you will. You were a coach for a while, college basketball coach, coaching the women at Arkansas for a few years. What would this be like from your perspective? And I'm sure you've talked to coaches. You're very close to a lot of coaches in college basketball, just on what it's like for them right now. We were joking beforehand that they'd have more time right now to do things that they never thought they could do, including reading books, which your book out, might be a time for them to do that. So put yourself back into that coaching role and what it's like for these guys right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was with John Calipari and the Kentucky team when the news broke that the SEC tournament was going to be canceled. Yeah. And I stood right there when he talked to his team. And it kind of took me back, honestly, to when I was an assistant coach at Kentucky, back with Rex Chapman and Ed Davender and Winston Bennett, all those guys. I had the privilege to coach at some point in my career.
Sure.
But it was I think the most difficult conversations were early when the coach had to walk into a locker room, walk into a meeting room in a hotel, wherever they were at that point in March, early March, and say, we're heading home. And then to find out 3 hours later, we're heading home for good. Like there's no NCAA tournament. And that had to be some very difficult times with a lot of tears shed, man, because as a coach, especially with your seniors, if you had them for all 4 years, maybe 5 years, that goes beyond family, man. That's a deep, deep love and all the things you've been through together. And for it to just suddenly come to a halt like it did, no one's ever been through something like that, unless it's, dealing individually, like with an injury that happens with someone their senior year. So I have tremendous faith in the coaches that I am close with, that I have spoken with. They've handled it the right way. I think they've used it to talk about life and how precious it is, how valuable it is, how we cannot take things for granted. And I think there have been a lot of growing lessons, a lot of life teaching moments that will come out of this. I'm going to believe that these guys that went through it 10 years from now, 20 years from now, man, they'll really be able to pour into their own kids, into their own families, a life lesson that was learned back during March of 2020.
You're a dad. I remember when we had you on last time, we talked a little bit about parenting a teenage girl, which we're both doing, and certainly a husband. And, you travel a lot around this time, at least in the early part of March, when people started paying attention to this. When did this hit your radar that this was a little more serious? Because I think it caught a lot of people off guard. It certainly caught me off guard. I knew it was serious. I knew we kind of had to wash our hands more and maybe not handshake with everybody. But this shut down the entire country in many ways. When did this kind of hit your radar?
Yeah, my first two games in the SEC tournament were on that Thursday of championship week, is what we call it on ESPN. And Wednesday night, I was out to dinner with Carl Ravitch and Marty Smith and our producer and director. And we saw on our phone where the NBA game had been delayed, canceled, postponed, whatever the first word they used for it.
Yeah.
And we all looked at each other at dinner that night and said, we're done. Like as we just, that next 12 hours, 24 hours, how quickly things changed, not only for the college athletes across the country in basketball, but just for our country, and then scrambling to get home and being on airplanes. I remember flying back from Nashville that night, back to my home in Northwest Arkansas. I had two different flights that connected. And I think I remember talking to the flight attendant, both those planes were 85, 90 passenger jets. There was maybe 10 people on. Like, it was quickly shutting down. People weren't going anywhere. So it's been we've adjusted like everybody else on the fly, and we've taken it serious as a family. And, we've been very, very cautious about, leaving our home and where we've gone and who we've been around, and keeping our social distance and all that in place. And then just a lot of prayer, man. Our country right now, it's at war, and with an invisible enemy, I think is how our leadership has put it, man. That's spot on. And I know it's driven me to a lot more time of prayer for others instead of focusing on prayer for myself and my immediate family. And I think that's good.
I think it's really good. When do you think this is educated? This is an uneducated guess, probably a silly question, but when do you think this will start to, not when, let me try this again. Do you think that we'll be able to get back to normal anytime soon? I'm thinking about the NBA, right? And they're trying to figure out if they can finish the season. I'm thinking about even college football. You're in Arkansas, thinking about Arkansas trying to pack a stadium with 75,000 people on a Saturday afternoon in just 5 or 6 months. Is that even realistic? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm like everybody else. I'm watching it day by day, and you just don't know. And even the people that are making those decisions right now, they're digesting that information 24 hours around and trying to project, trying to, educate themselves, educate our nation right now, what this timeline is going to look like. Jason, I don't really know. I think the health of our country, and that goes in a lot of different directions with the health of our economy, our mental health, all those things, how we're handling this time in our life. But that overall health of our country is a huge, huge, massive concern. That if it delays the start of college football by a month, because kids need time to get back on campus and start practicing, maybe that's delayed by a month.
Yeah.
Then maybe that's the case. But my guess right now, where we sit right now having this conversation, I would say it's 50-50 that college football starts on its normal playing date. That's the best guess I could give you.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and obviously none of us know. I just thought it would, right, for conversation purposes, it'd be interesting to ask you, because I think a lot of us in the sports world like to say, yeah, we think it's this, we know it might be that. We have no idea. We really don't, because we're still in the midst of this thing. Let me dive and pivot into your faith a little bit, and I promise you we'll get to the book. The Film Doesn't Lie, Evaluating Your Life One Play at a Time, brand new book for Jimmy. Recommend everybody pick it up, and we're going to talk about it in a second. And a lot of what's in the book is actually what we're going to ask you right now about your faith. Your faith's so important to you. You mentioned having more time, maybe intentional time to connect with the Lord. But during this season, the last couple weeks, what this has allowed, I think, is for a lot of believers that I've talked to really kind of do some introspective, searching, soul searching, looking at themselves and saying, okay, God, are we good here? And I wonder for you what your faith has meant to you during this time in really trying to dive deeper into the Lord in a time where you might be traveling more or watching a ton of games. This now has a time for you can connect more with the Lord.
Well, absolutely it is. And I know, personally, it's created more space, I guess, in my heart to allow my heart to hear from him because my thoughts, my hours aren't consumed right now by the things that normally consume me during March Madness. So there's been a created void there that has given me, thankfully, more room in my heart to really get quiet before the Lord and search myself. And you read my book, that's what the book's all about. But, it's created that time again for me. It seemed like the last time I really had that time was when I was writing the book. That was about two summers, I guess, is when it took me to do it. And when you're writing and challenging people like I did in my book, man, it was a tremendous challenge to my own heart, Jason, when I wrote it. Mm-hmm. But that was last summer when I finished it up. And then since then, I've been busy like everybody else, man, just ripping and roaring through college basketball and coaching our daughter's cross-country team in the fall and being a dad and being a husband. And my mom and dad live 3 houses down. My dad's dealing with liver cancer. My mom's 83. Just the worries of the world just kind of suck you in and suck you up. So, over the past 7 or 8 months of my life, I've just been going like everybody else. Have certainly tried to keep that 1% of my time in my life quiet every morning with my devotional, my scripture reading, my prayer time, all those things. But it's I'm not going to say it's knocked me back because that's not the right word, but it's allowed me to step back and have more time to really say, okay, God, where are we now? Where am I with you now? And what are you trying to teach me right now during this time in my life?
We'll get back to our conversation with Jimmy Dykes in just a moment, but want to tell you about International Justice Mission, IJM, partners with us here at Sports Spectrum. We love what they stand for. We love what they are all about. And when we sit here and we learn about the reality of slavery, I want you to think about this. There are thousands of traffickers using all of their power to keep people enslaved forever, all because slavery is profitable. They simply value money more than they value human life. And these slave owners are relentless, calculated, and tenacious, unafraid to use their power, their money, and their influence to oppress others. And we must act. Each one of us here needs to partner with IJM. It's why we believe in IJM and becoming a freedom partner, giving $24 or more each month, regular opportunities to pray, and advocate with IJM for the end of slavery. The single largest barrier to IJM freeing millions of slaves is a lack of financial resources. Without the monthly giving of freedom partners, slavery will not end. It's that simple. IJM knows where the slaves are, and they have a plan to rescue them. It's why we love IJM and the work that they do. Join IJM today and become a freedom partner. Go to the website ijm.org/TF, ijm.org/TF. And because of freedom partners, IJM is setting slaves free and putting their owners behind bars. Join the fight to end slavery today. We're also presented today by Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world. Compassion sponsors like you and I are helping over 2 million children in 25 countries, and yet it's never larger than one child at a time, one day at a time, and one sponsor at a time. We need your help here. Children are waiting to be released from poverty, and you can help make that possible by sponsoring a child through Compassion. $38 a month, tax deductible, your sponsorship providing access to school, medical care, food, vocational training, and most importantly, the opportunity to know Jesus Christ. Check out the website, compassion.com/sportsspectrum, compassion.com/sportsspectrum, and pray about sponsoring a child today. Now back to our conversation with Jimmy Dykes from ESPN here on Sports Spectrum. All right, let's pivot to the book. I'm excited about talking about this book. It's a really good one. It's called The Film Doesn't Lie, Evaluating Your Life One Play at a Time. Reese Davis wrote the foreword, and just reading what's on the cover of the book from Rick Barnes, University of Tennessee head basketball coach, it says, a must-read for anyone pursuing a more authentic walk with God. So it's a basketball book, but as I read it, Jimmy, when you really open it up, it's a book that's way more than basketball. Tell us about it.
Yeah, it is. It's a book that, like I said, Jason, it really challenged my heart when I wrote it, because I start dealing with a lot of areas I think we all struggle with, think about, need to evaluate from time to time. And when you start talking about how much unforgiveness do I harbor in my heart,
yeah,
and then you apply the scripture to how God says to handle forgiveness in our life. Boy, that can take you to your knees, man. And it took me to a whole nother level in just that one simple area about some unforgiveness that I had harbored in my heart, resentment from different areas of my life. The chapter on the power of my spoken words. I talk about, do my own words align with what God says about me? When I speak about others, is that proper? Is that right? And it's a book that I think has really crossed over with a lot of folks. I've heard from a lot of people across the country, from far more than just coaches. A ton of college football and basketball coaches have a copy of this book in their hand right now or on their desk, waiting for them when they get back to work. But I think it's a book that really, if you dive into it, you're going to not only be, I think, brought in to my world as a college basketball analyst for ESPN, through some really cool stories and conversations I've had with Coach K and Roy Williams and John Calipari and Gus Malzahn. But that book is all about calling people to a new authentic walk with God, a new obedience in their life, taking time to evaluate where we really are as a person. And man, that's important, and it's hard. That's some hard stuff to do sometimes, but that's when real growth occurs, is when we take time to study our life like a game film and place value on it like a coach does when he's breaking down his own game film with his team.
I love in the book when you talk about establishing non-negotiables to maintain commitments to family, to God, to oneself. What hard lessons did you have to learn to realize that these non-negotiables were so essential?
Well, I'll give you the best example of a non-negotiable in my life. And I'm not saying this to say, man, I got this figured out, because I don't, man. I don't. I wrote about things in that book that are real life stuff, real life issues that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, or my closest buddies that I allow to be in my inner circle deal with, or just random people I run into that I know they struggle. Mm. And one of the non-negotiables that I started with my own family about 3 years ago now was we don't leave our house in the morning as a family without us praying together. And that's different now than a dad right now saying, I pray for my family every day. I'm not talking about praying for your family. I'm talking about praying with your family. And the power that's brought into our life, the dynamic that it's brought into our life as a family, in terms of how my wife views me in a different way now as the spiritual leader of our home, how our daughter at 14, I see the example that I'm giving her, because I write about in the book, she's going to be attracted to in her life one of these days, in her husband, what she sees in her dad right now growing up, and how I treat her mom and the values that I place in this home. And if I'm not the leader in that area of placing God first in our home right off the bat in our day, then who is? Like, who's that responsibility on?
Yeah,
it's on me. And it really woke me up when I came to that realization. But I'm telling you, man, just the simple power of that non-negotiable in our home is about as good an example as I can give. And it's a non-negotiable. I guess there are some times that, obviously, if I'm not in town,
right, and
there may be some times where maybe one of us is sick. We don't want to wake someone up. But I'm telling you, 99.5% of our days year round, they start with a quick prayer. Absolutely.
That's awesome. Again, the new book is called The Film Doesn't Lie, Evaluating Your Life One Play at a Time. Can you give us one of your favorite stories from the book? I know there's a lot of good ones in there, and a lot of different stories that you share, and certainly a lot of great principles. Is there a story that you can think of that's one of your favorites from the book?
Yeah, a couple of them. There's a story in there about a football player from the Naval Academy who got diagnosed with cancer his senior year, at the start of his senior year. And he was a starter, in the Naval Academy's terrific football program, and that got taken away from him. I tell his story about how he purposely chose to stay at the Naval Academy and go through all of his chemo and radiation treatments, and never missed one thing that was required of him as a cadet. And man, those are stressful days from 5 o'clock in the morning till midnight, and just what he learned through that process, and the word commitment, and what came out of that conversation. And I challenged the readers after that story to really look at that word commitment in their life, and what are you saying you're committed to, and how strong is that commitment? Because I thought I knew the meaning of the word commitment until I sat down and had a conversation with that kid that day, probably 10 or 12 years ago, prior to a football bowl game when I was a football reporter for ESPN. That's a tremendous story. I think the other one that really jumps out at me and has impacted me was two seasons ago, Reese Davis and I, we had the game Duke at Louisville. And if you remember that game, it's one of the most bizarre and tremendous games, I think, of the 2018-19 season. Duke was down 21, 22 points at Louisville in the second half and came back and won the game. Louisville was a top 15 ranked team. And the morning of that shoot around, Coach K, we got into a conversation about the power of our words as a leader and how that influences him within a game, within a 2-hour game, and how important it is for him to be in control of his words. Even when he's not sure what to say to his team, he's going to say positive things, even in tough times. And that exact conversation that I had with Coach K at 11 o'clock that morning in Louisville, Kentucky, played out at 9 o'clock that night on national TV. Afterwards, he talked about that, and Zion Williamson talked about what Coach K was saying even when we were down 20 points, and the power of those words. And those two stories have really, I think, resonated with a lot of readers from the feedback that I'm getting. And then I think the personal story of just the power of forgiveness and how hard that is to do.
Oh, yeah.
But the obedience that we're called to have from God's written word about that word obedience.
Well, we could spend a whole podcast, you and me, talking about forgiveness, my friend. So I
Yes.
completely understand that. There's a great chapter title that I'm going to use to kind of pivot into my next question here. It's just called Survive the Drought, which I love that title. And I love kind of the examples that you talked about in the different droughts of a few of the people that you reference in that chapter. But why don't you spend this time encouraging others, because it feels like we're all in a drought right now, and trying to survive it through this virus and through everything that's unknown and uncertain. Can you just encourage a little bit about why that's so important to just survive the drought?
Yeah, well, Jason, I think we've all either been through a drought already in our life, or we're in the middle of one right now, like our country is, or there'll be a new drought within 2 or 3 years. And those droughts come in a lot of different forms, man, from bad reports at doctors to loss of jobs, loss of loved ones, kids that go off on a direction that we know they don't need to be going on, and all the hard stuff that goes with that. And droughts come into our life in a lot of different forms. I think it's so important to be intentional. I'll call it a game plan about how you maneuver through those times in life. And God's written word gives us great barriers, boundaries, guidelines in how to do that. And just off the top of my head, without looking at that chapter, I know that 2 or 3 things are very important. Number one, you can't get stuck on why.
Yep.
Like, you just can't continue to sit there and say, why did this happen? Why is this happening? Why did I get this report? You can't get stuck on why. That's a bad spot to be in. And I think the enemy uses that, man. He loves to stay in our ear about why. And you can't get stuck there. You got to move on and just have the mindset of a sovereign God who always loves us. He always cares for us. He's always looking out for our best interest, and move on from that point. Then you have to attack the moment, attack the circumstance that you're around.
Yeah.
I think one key thing in that, Jason, is this: remain thankful in the drought. And man, that's hard. And I talked about stories in my book of people that I think right now of one of our friends here in Arkansas that lost her teenage daughter in a car wreck one night. And man, the drought was on immediately. Like, that's as severe of a drought as any of us can imagine. And I remember talking with her about how she learned to be thankful even during the most difficult drought of her life. And God, man, he loves that. I think he rewards that. He seeks that in our heart. I know the enemy hates that. The enemy hates for us to be thankful and finding things to be thankful for within the drought. Certainly, you're not going to be thankful for that specific drought. Okay, but you can remain thankful for the things that you do have in your life, and thankful for the good that's going to come out of this circumstance if you set your heart on it.
Again, the book is called, that's great stuff there, Jimmy. The book is called The Film Doesn't Lie, Evaluating Your Life One Play at a Time by Jimmy Dykes, our guest here today on Sports Spectrum. Pick up that book everywhere books are available. Jimmy, this has been great, buddy. Thanks so much for being here on the show. Hopefully we'll get you back and actually be able to talk some college basketball or some sports or something that's going on. But for now, everybody pick up his new book. And again, thanks so much for being here, brother. God bless you.
Yeah, Jason, God bless you too. Thanks for having me.
And many thanks to Jimmy Dykes for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. His newest book, again, is called The Film Doesn't Lie, Evaluating Your Life One Play at a Time. Reese Davis wrote the foreword from ESPN. And listen to a couple of the endorsements here, specifically Gus Malzahn, Auburn University's head football coach. He says, Jimmy adds needed focus in our pursuit of a real God. I love that. Rick Barnes from the University of Tennessee says, Jimmy masterfully communicates the importance of evaluating where you are in crucial areas of your life. This is a book to get, and it's a book to get right now. It's available on Amazon, everywhere books are sold. The Film Doesn't Lie, Jimmy Dykes. Many thanks to Jimmy, and many thanks to you for joining us here on Sports Spectrum. We are presented by IJM, the International Justice Mission. Thanks to them, and thanks to our partners, Compassion International, for sponsoring this podcast as well. We love what Compassion and IJM are all about. So thanks to them. Thanks to you. Thanks for listening. Check out our website, sportspectrum.com. That's the home base for all of our content here on the show, sportspectrum.com. And then subscribe to this podcast and tell others about it. This podcast doesn't get listened to if it's not for people like you listening and people like you telling others about these stories that we're bringing to you here on the show, here on Sports Spectrum. So tell someone, share it on your Facebook page, your Twitter page, your Instagram page, wherever you share on social media. Definitely let them know that you heard the Sports Spectrum podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time right here on Sports Spectrum. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and stay safe.